Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this webinar. This is about unpacking sexual and gender-based harassment in Nova Scotia skilled trades. My name is Tracy Boyer. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a mother of three and the project coordinator for the YWCA Halifax Shift Change project. I'm helping behind the scenes today. As we start, I welcome you to take a moment, settle in. The days are busy for many of us, and the morning spring light is coming, but maybe not to this morning. My wish for all of you today is to take time to take care of yourself. I invite you just right now to do a really simple breathing exercise. Just get yourself settled. We're going to do one deep breath in and one deep breath out to just get ready for what we're going to be in today. So here we go. I'm going to count to three. We'll breathe in and then just let it out whenever it works for you. So 1, 2, 3. Okay. So we're coming together via Zoom. We're grounded in each of the territories where we reside as treaty people. If you're not from Kjipuktuk, Mi'kma'ki, please feel invited to share the territory you are calling in from on the chat. In doing this work, in seeking justice and change, I believe we honor the first peoples of this land. We also acknowledge that the land upon which we gather is unceded Mi'kmaq territory in Kjipuktuk, Halifax. Mi'kma'ki is covered by the historic treaties of peace and friendship. We pay our respects to the Mi'kmaq people who have occupied this land for over 12,000 years, past, present, and future. We also acknowledge that people of African descent have been in Nova Scotia for over 400 years. We honor and offer gratitude to those ancestors of African descent who came before us to this land. I acknowledge my ancestry as European, and I see myself as a guest on these lands, working with other guests to learn and unlearn our colonial ways, to step into responsibility for change, to take up less space, and to sit with the discomfort of acknowledging the individual, structural, and systemic discrimination faced by Indigenous, Black, and African Nova Scotians. So in this work, we honor the principles of reciprocity, the generosity of First Peoples who helped my Acadian ancestors so that they did not die of starvation. We do this work for ourselves, for our children, our grandchildren, and for each other. May we start this webinar with open hearts, open minds, and open spirits, and proceed with kindness and respect. I'd like to introduce Stephanie Gill, who is the coordinator of the YWCA Halifax Sexual and Gender-Based Harassment Project. She's been involved in anti-sexualized violence work for 10 years through activism, education, professional roles, and as a registered social worker candidate with the Nova Scotia College of Social Workers. Her social work practice is truly grounded in love and the belief that we can create a future where everyone has everything they need to live a good life. She's very inspiring. I've learned a lot from Stephanie over the course of this time, as have many who have been in our agency network. You're courageous and compassionate. Thank you for being in this work, Stephanie, and I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you for the introduction. So my name is Stephanie, my pronouns are she and her, and I'm going to be doing a brief overview of our report before we move to the panel discussion. And today we're going to be having a difficult conversation. We're going to be talking about sexual and gender-based harassment and violence. And we recognize that this topic can bring up a lot of different emotions, and we encourage you to do what you need to take care of yourself. So the YWCA Halifax Sexual and Gender-Based Harassment and Skilled Trades Project conducted exploratory research and evaluation between July 2023 and October 2023 to understand the prevalence of sexual and gender-based harassment in the skilled trade sector, its impact on women and gender diverse people, and the underlying organizational cultures that contribute to the issue. Our research included a survey which had 101 women and gender diverse people respond across Nova Scotia, and 8 follow-up interviews where we gained an understanding of their experiences from a deeper perspective. And we learned that women and gender diverse people endure significant harassment in the skilled trade sector, which is limiting their job satisfaction and causing some to leave the sector. So on this slide, we have an infographic that shows a little bit about what is happening in the skilled trade sector. So we heard that 91% of 101 survey respondents reported experiencing at least one form of sexual and/or gender-based harassment while working in the skilled trades. And when asked about specific behaviors that they've experienced, women and gender diverse people reported 15 different behaviors, from 75% experiencing comments or actions that were meant to insult them because of their sex or gender, all the way to 4% reporting that they had experienced actual or attempted rape or sexual assault in the workplace. Sexual and gender-based harassment in the skilled trades is often perpetrated by individuals in positions of power in the workplace, such as managers, supervisors, business owners, and senior coworkers. We heard that 68% of those engaging in harassing behaviors were either direct managers, supervisors, business owners, and senior coworkers, and that 98% of the time, the people engaging in harassing behaviors were men, and 92% of survey respondents said that their workplaces were male-dominated at the time of their most recent experience of harassment. And when women and gender diverse people report harassment and draw attention to the harmful workplace cultures, they are often labeled as quote unquote too sensitive or a troublemaker. Organizational inaction in response to sexual and gender-based harassment in the skilled trades has contributed to a culture of silence. We heard that 59% of survey respondents are not at all satisfied with the way that the company handles their reports, and 0% were extremely satisfied. So no one is extremely satisfied with how their reports of sexual harassment are being handled in their organizations. And only 36% of respondents said that the harassment actually stopped after they reported it to their company. And the high levels of harassment and underreporting tell us that women and gender diverse people do not feel safe reporting, or that they do not have confidence in how their organizations will respond, or both. And sexual and gender-based harassment are workplace hazards that negatively impact employees' mental and emotional health. In addition, instances of sexual and gender-based harassment decrease employee productivity, negatively impact relationships with coworkers, and result in employees having a decreased commitment to their organizations. Responding to sexual and gender-based harassment at the individual level alone by punishing individuals that are engaging in harassing behaviors will not be effective to eliminate sexual and gender-based harassment from workplaces. We must also address sexual and gender-based harassment at an organizational level to eliminate workplace harassment. I will now just do a brief overview of the demographics of our survey respondents. So on this slide, you can see that 40% of respondents identified as belonging to the construction sector, 22% service, 19% industrial manufacturing, 12% motive power, 2% technology, and 2% other trades. For length of time, you can see that the majority of respondents have been in the trades between 3 and 10 years. As well, majority of the respondents are at the apprentice stage of their trades journey. And 80% of the respondents were between the ages of 25 and 44, 98% identified as a woman and 2% as gender diverse, 88% identified as white, 6% as Indigenous, 2% as Black or African Nova Scotian, and the remaining 4% as racialized. 51% of respondents identified as heterosexual, and 41% of respondents identified as members of 2S LGBTQIA+ communities, and 16% of respondents identified as a person with a disability. And just a note about the demographics and the responses, the data in our research, it is well documented that women and gender diverse people living with disabilities, 2S LGBTQIA+ community members, immigrant, refugee, Indigenous, African, Nova Scotian, Black, and racialized women and gender diverse people experience heightened levels of sexual and gender-based harassment and violence, and encounter systemic and structural barriers when seeking support and resources. The number of participants who self-identified as gender diverse, immigrant, refugee, African, Nova Scotian, Black, and/or racialized is limited. Therefore, the data gathered in a report does not provide a comprehensive understanding of the inequities faced by these communities in the skilled trade sector. We believe that the data in this report would have shifted and may have looked worse if we had the comprehensive data to represent the experiences of these communities in the skilled trades. However, our report does provide a foundational understanding of sexual and gender-based harassment in the skilled trades and helps us to start the conversation to enact change. We'll now move into our panel discussion. And I'm very excited about the conversation that we're going to be having today. We're going to be exploring the topic of hypermasculine workplace culture and its role in sexual and gender-based harassment. We'll also address some of the themes that we've been hearing in our work and explore the role that leaders and individuals working in the skilled trades can take to promote gender justice and some strategies for tangible transformation. Before we begin the conversation, I'm going to be introducing our panelists. So our first panelist, Robert Seymour Wright, is a social worker and sociologist whose 34-year career has spanned the fields of education, child welfare, forensic mental health, trauma, sexual violence, and cultural competence. Robert was raised in the Black Baptist tradition, but was baptized in the Adventist Church at the age of 13. Like James Baldwin, he began preaching at 14. His pioneering work with colleagues in cultural competence and conducting cultural assessments has received national attention. His extensive pro bono work gave birth to the People's Counseling Clinic, a nonprofit mental health clinic, which he serves as the executive director. And Robert also serves as the acting executive director of the African Nova Scotian Justice Institute. So welcome, Robert, to our panel. And then our next panelist is Stephen Law. Stephen is a father to 2 teenage girls. He is a facilitator, trainer, and executive coach who has designed and delivered the Shift Change Gender Inclusive Leadership Training course, which supports male supervisors to understand and act on transforming the trades to be more inclusive, equitable, and diverse. He is an internationally certified mediation coach in dialogue for peaceful change and is an organizational change consultant who has worked in Northern Ireland, India, Latin America, and across North America. He has written 2 novels, Tailings of War and Peace and Under Her Skin. Welcome, Steve, to our panel. And our final panelist, Dana Kabat-Farr, is a professor in the Leadership and Organizations Department of the Faculty of Management at Dalhousie University. Her research focuses on workplace social experiences, both negative, incivility, sexual harassment, and positive, such as citizenship and supervisor support. Dr. Kabat-Farr conducts her academic work with the goal of shedding light on the social landscapes of organizations that can insidiously erode diversity and inclusion by undermining employee success and satisfaction. Her work has been published in outlets such as Journal of Management, Journal of Business Ethics, and Harvard Business. So welcome, Dana, and welcome to all our panelists. It's great to have you here today.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you. So we're going to move into our conversation. So we all know that there's a housing crisis in Nova Scotia, and the public eye has turned towards the skilled trades as a vital component in meeting the housing needs of Nova Scotians. Given the existing labor shortage and upcoming retirements, Nova Scotia needs to attract and retain thousands of new skilled trades professionals. And a diverse workforce is going to be necessary to address the labor shortage in the skilled trades. To diversify the workforce, skilled trades workplaces must be free from all forms of harassment and safe for all employees. And so, Robert, this first question is for you. Why is it important that we understand workplace culture change in the skilled trades from an anti-oppressive lens?
That's a good question, and your preamble to the question is very telling. I think that we recognize that the economy of Nova Scotia is requiring kind of all hands on deck. That means that all peoples who are currently here, all peoples who are coming here, will need to be employed here. And one of the things we need to recognize is the workplace has always historically been an oppressive environment. Oppressive to women, oppressive to racialized persons, oppressive to queer people. I would say the culture of the workplace has been historically oppressive to all peoples there. the kind of hazing and the kind of initiations that sometimes happen to people in the trades. You know, there are stories of people, you know, nailing your belt to the platform you're working in, or super gluing your equipment so that you can't access it. This this oppression has been a part of the skilled trades workplace because it's a reflection really of the oppression in society. So if we want to kind of transform the workplace to make it more inclusive for all of the people who are increasingly taking up space in Nova Scotia, then we need to address that, not just as behaviors of individuals, but as a cultural phenomenon of oppression that occurs in the workplace. And I say that Nova Scotia is becoming more diverse, but it's always been diverse. So women, racialized people, queer folk have always been here, but are beginning to take up more space in society. And so the oppression that has historically kept them out of these places is now needing to be addressed as we enter these spaces.
Thank you for that. And Steve and Dana, I'm wondering if there's anything that you'd like to add about the historical, cultural, and structural context of the skilled trades.
Well, one of the first things I want to say is just acknowledge a little bit about what came before even Robert's conversation and the report that you presented. And I just want to sit in that for a second because the numbers are stark. They're very stark.
Mm-hmm.
And as Robert described, you know, if you're racialized or if you're female, gender diverse, or come from the queer community, this is the daily life for you. And you're very familiar with the stats, but when it's a question of seeing those stark results, I think that I think we just need to sit in that for a moment to recognize and remember what it is, the level that we're talking about, and it's profound, it's deep, and it's ongoing. And so that I just want to acknowledge that and recognize that, and then also you know, just affirm in those spaces what Robert's saying, and just that how much we really need to recognize that it's actually, it impacts everyone. As a white cisgendered male, older male now even, you know, this also has impacted me and impacts folks who may not see themselves under those lenses, but they are also equally impacted by them in different ways, and they don't see it often, but the ramifications for all of us is quite profound.
Thank you. And moving on to our next question. So in some of our meetings with industry leaders, a theme that has come up is that sexual and gender-based harassment is a societal issue, that it's everywhere, and they don't know what they can do about it. And so this is a societal issue. And we also believe it's important to highlight that it is much more prevalent in male-dominated workplaces. 91% of survey respondents reporting at least one form of sexual or gender-based harassment, and 82% of respondents reported experiencing sexual and gender-based harassment multiple times while working in the skilled trades. And so, Dana, this question is for you. How do we ensure that leadership is taking responsibility for the harassment that happens within their workplaces when the attitude is, this is just the way things are?
Yeah, thanks for that question. It's a really good one. And I first want to say that it will be the role of the leader to take responsibility, to instill change and shift the way things are done. It was striking in your introduction, Stephanie, that you provided that unfortunately respondents are saying 68% of the time the perpetrator is in a leadership position, is an owner, is a senior manager. So that in and of itself is its own challenge. So harassment, as described in the report, takes many different forms. And because of that, the responsibility and the responses that leaders and managers will take will also take many different forms. So beyond perhaps the obvious need to attend to and take very seriously issues of sexual violence and sexual assault, leaders are going to need to address the undercurrents of disrespect and harassment, those one-off, offhanded, insulting comments, the unwelcome questions about someone's personal life, and so on. So if you look at the stats that are presented in the report, harassment, as we've touched on already, is a common problem. And what that means is that it implicates many, both in its consequences as well as when we're thinking about who's taking part in this practice. And often when managers and leaders are told that they need to, quote unquote, deal with harassment, they think that this is going to need to take a legalistic approach. And in sometimes it does need to take that approach and should. But what these stats show is that sex and gender-based harassment is a cultural problem, one that you likely can't fire yourself or fire your way out of, right? Leaders instead can take responsibility and address harassment in other ways. So it's important to acknowledge that workplaces are a network of relationships, and many leaders will be uncomfortable or resistant to calling out the behavior of some of their employees, people they trust, people they rely on, and may even call their friends. Calling out is when you kind of publicly shame someone for a behavior, and that public shaming has lasting effects. That person then can feel alienated, fearful, and it violates those friendships that I started by talking about. So Professor Loretta Ross instead advocates that we need to establish a call-in culture. And that's where you communicate with one another from a place of respect, where you're considering the context. And this is often taking place in a one-on-one conversation. So kind of to contrast that idea of it needs to be kind of a formal legal approach, encouraging formal reporting to bring this to the one-on-one level. These types of call-in efforts to change behavior can preserve relationships. They can advance people's learning and even make someone feel included when they're actually learning that their behavior was this time out of line. So you can imagine that change might move effectively through an organization when the leader is communicating that harassing behaviors isn't actually the way things are done around here or shouldn't be done around here, and that the workplace is changing. And the leader then is there to support that change, to help with awareness and learning. And so that way, the question was asking, how do we instill responsibility? Responsibility in this way would be enacted through addressing mistreatment in ways that are shifting the norms and conveying what's expected and starting to have conversations about how everyone can play a role in this needed cultural shift.
Thank you for that. Robert and Steve, is there anything that you'd like to add about the cultural shift and how leadership, how to ensure that leadership is taking responsibility? No. Okay. So.
Yeah.
Okay.
We'll catch it in the next questions.
Okay. So we'll move on to the next question. So another theme that has been coming up in our work is this idea that we just need more women in the skilled trades, and that will be enough to end sexual and gender-based harassment in the sector. Through our project work, we have learned that there's been a lot of resources that have been put into preparing women and gender diverse people to enter into male-dominated environments through resiliency training and preparing them to have a quote unquote tough skin. And while it is vital that there are resources and supports for women and gender diverse people who are entering into and remaining in the trades, we have not been paying as much attention to, and we need to turn our gaze to the organizational cultures within the skilled trades that reinforce and perpetuate the norms and values of masculinity contest cultures. And masculinity contest cultures can be defined as organizational cultures that adhere to harmful and rigid gender norms, or being a quote unquote real man is defined by physical strength, showing no weaknesses, and a rejection of femininity. And it's a place where men must continually prove their masculinity. And Steve, this question is for you. So how do we make room for more than one way of being in the skilled trades? How do we disrupt these harmful and rigid gender norms so that the skilled trades can become a safe workplace for all employees?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the big questions is what do we do about it? And I think, you know, the course that I do is it's a training male supervisors in the trades around gender inclusion. And the reality is most of these guys come in super worried, super scared about what we're going to talk about. And maybe they're going to get attacked and they're going to be seen as being evil and terrible people. And what we instead do is we embrace the humanness that they all are. And I think that what we do when we do that, and when we start to kind of recognize and see and understand each other as an individual and where they're coming from in their context and the fears they may have, the worries, that they start to realize that those norms that are in place aren't actually norms that they subscribe to for the most part. Most of them are actually, you know, when you ask them, I start out by asking them about a woman in their life or a female in their life who's important to them. And they begin that place that personalizes it for them so that they start to realize that when we're talking about gender and when we're talking about questions around inclusion, they're actually about themselves and the people in their world that they love and they care about. And that begins to make that shift and to be able to recognize, oh, wait, I don't actually want to work in an environment where that is kind of degraded or people are maligned in different ways because, oh, right, I have people in my life who that may be happening to them in their workplaces, and that would be terrible for them. And so I think that men, for the most part, because the norms have been so strongly ingrained, it's hard to step out of them. But when we go through the course, most of the men actually want to be out of them, and they actually don't support any of this, and think, oh, I want to do, we need to do different. And I think what hasn't been in place is that invitation to be different, and it's okay to be different. And when they actually see that other people are actually responding and behaving different, then actually that starts to shift it, and people recognize, oh, wait a second, I don't actually have to be this way, and this actually isn't beneficial to me. And actually, when we look at things in a much more inclusive way, it actually benefits everybody. So, you know, instead of like all of us having to lift 50 pounds, 75 pounds, and then after 15 years or 20 years, our backs are broken, we realize that actually the different accommodations that are made are actually benefiting all of us, and rather than sort of seeing it as like a weakness if you can't do something, or you or when there's concerns about, oh, they're changing the standards of what is required in this job, when in fact those standards were like ridiculous for anybody to have to meet. And so just to say that I think that part of it is that question about helping and the invitation for men to be able to recognize that they can do things differently, and in fact they all want it, so they're asking for it too. So we need to be, and businesses and companies need to be responding to that because the guys want it as well.
Yeah, thank you for that. Robert and Dana, is there anything that you'd like to add on? Oh, who wants to go?
Go ahead, Robert.
Go ahead, Dana.
Oh.
Well, I was just going to say that Stephen makes a really great point, that culture is very, very slow to change in many ways. And so the workplace culture is an artifact of a very, very long time ago. And the men entering those spaces today are often not representative of that, what I'll call a toxic culture. They are as oppressed by it as the women, queer folk, and racialized folk who are in the workplace today. I'd say many are.
I was just going to weigh in and think about that gender is on a spectrum, or can be on a spectrum, as is masculinity, and what it means to be a man, and how people practice their masculinity and demonstrate it at work, and like the Robert and Steve are talking about, the hypermasculinity norms isn't comfortable for a lot of the men. And so we as humans have this like unresistible urge to put people in buckets, and then a label comes, and so it's easiest to just think about, oh, that's a man's job, and that's what it means to be a man, is to be, yeah, tough, work long hours, lift incredible amounts of weight, et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, to the extent that men feel empowered to speak up and comfortable to endorse and enact behaviors differently that align with the same gender label that we ascribe to some folks, then that's one step in the right direction, I'd say. So yeah. I'm happy to hear that, and I see in the chat that Steve's workshops are transformative. That's awesome.
Yeah, and also in the chat, there's a question that's asking what men want, like, do they want to help make change? And I don't know if Steve or any of the other panelists would like to respond to that. I guess from your experience in the course, what do men want?
Well, I would say that men generally in the trades don't necessarily, that's not something that they're thinking about, quite frankly. And they're not thinking about inclusion. They're not thinking about those kind of questions unless it starts to appear and present itself in their workplace. But when we bring them in together and we talk about what needs to change in the workplace, and we ask men what men want, eventually, as they develop their awareness and understanding and realize the depth of what's going on and the things that are happening in that workplace, the men want change, and they realize, they come to an understanding and awareness that they actually want change and need change, and then become active champions in doing that, and start to take actions on making change. And so and that's the hopeful place. That's the transformative, hopeful place. I would say, though, the vast majority of men working in the trades never think about this, don't think about it, don't care about it. It's not part of their antenna of awareness. If you are experiencing exclusion in any level, absolutely, you're aware of it all the time. For those who aren't experiencing it, they don't know.
Thank you. Robert and Tina, would you like to add on to any of that? Okay. Before we move to the next question, there's also another question in the chat about kind of the call-in approach. And so this person is asking, what are the carrots versus sticks with a call-in approach? How would you make the message palatable and or sticky? And how would this practice reshape incentives? I don't know who wants to respond to that.
Since I brought it up, I can take the first stab at it. So the point of a call-in approach is lots of organizations, and I would say endorsed by our legal system, view formal reporting as the gold standard response to harassment. And along with formal reporting comes lots of bureaucracy and scary business and like potential for firing and things like that. Not to say that formal reporting should be happening, but alongside of that, really there's a great need, and Steve touched on this. I'll touch on it again in another question that we have coming up. But we need to really instill learning and people to open their minds to these issues, because as Steve mentioned, some people just don't think about it. And it's not to excuse their ignorance and say, oh, there's no consequences because of ignorance, but we have to start somewhere with a lot of folks. And that starts by having conversations, and starts by, acknowledging some things that might be obvious to, especially folks that attend a webinar such as this.
Yes.
But to really have those conversations and have points where you're starting to establish norms and shape behavior in a way that people are not afraid. Because we also know that a lot of people aren't reporting, and there's a big problem with silence. And we saw some of the stats here as well. And that is like the culture of fear around, like we don't talk about it. And it's very difficult to talk about. If you talk about these issues, you are essentially accusing someone of being sexist, potentially with intersectional identities, potentially sexist and racist, homophobic. I mean, these are really big accusations. And sometimes with some of the really impactful experiences that folks experience, daily derogation for how they act or who they are, when a manager or supervisor gets a hold of that, the evidence there is like hearsay or what have you. And so the conversation, to my mind, needs to be very much about learning, education on a path to shaping behavior. As for the sticks, that's not to say we're going to let really egregious stuff fly. And my research shows that these subtle things are not so subtle at all, that they can be super impactful. So it's not to say we let it go forever either. But what I am saying is that we don't need to like make an example of someone as the be end of, or what's the phrase? Be end all. Anyways, as like the modal response. That the conversations need to be taken place because it's a huge issue.
Mm-hmm. I like what Dana said about, I think learning is the big word there, that there should be a response to this aspect of the culture by developing a culture where we are all encouraged to learn, and that the correcting of behavior is not punitive. This is not just for the sake of the person who is a perpetrator of the behavior. Many people do not report the assaults or the harassment that they're experiencing because they do not trust their organization with that information. Things are really bad for me, but things are going to get worse if I report. This person did this thing that makes me uncomfortable. I'd report it, but I really don't want this person who's just kind of ignorant in their discourse with me to get a hammer. And as a former director of child welfare, I cannot tell you how many times a young person waited until their 16th birthday to report repeated and ongoing sexual abuse that they were experiencing, because they knew that if they reported while they were still a child, their reporting would create mandatory responses by the system that would be beyond their control, and it would actually penalize them rather than help them. So I think the same thing is happening in systems where people are feeling like if I report, then I have to make a statement, and then I'm kind of I'm treated almost like a hostile witness to the harassment that I've been experiencing. So we need to have a much better culture in the workplace in responding to this. And the learning culture that Dana kind of suggested is the culture of choice, I think.
And what I would also argue is that we need the preventative side that is around professionalization in the industry and professional standards in the industry, which will help mitigate some of those microaggressions or some of those small comments, or not small, but comments that are made on a regular basis, or the joshing or bantering that are made on a regular basis. The preventative work and the role that other people have to model and mentor what is respectful workplace and what is respectful behavior towards one another, to be able to mitigate some of those challenges that are happening on a daily level before they get much more egregious, which would require some of the more reporting kinds of responses.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think that you all mentioned or highlighted this like a culture of fear. And we heard in the interviews and in the surveys that there's a very high level of fear of the people who are sharing their experiences with us. They did not want their organizations to know that they were sharing their experiences. So this culture of fear is really a key barrier to addressing sexual and gender-based harassment in the skilled trades. And moving on to our next question. So another theme that we've been hearing is this idea that women's gains in the workplace equals men's losses. We've been hearing that some men within the skilled trades are feeling threatened and like opportunities are being taken away from them, and that there's a fear that they will be reported to HR for harassment and that they need to censor themselves around women and gender diverse people in the workplace. And women and gender diverse people are often viewed as a problem or quote unquote too sensitive when they do report incidents of sexual and gender-based harassment. And the pervasive victim blaming that is evident in the trades has contributed to this culture of silence and culture of fear. And so, Robert, this question is for you. So some men are feeling threatened, which could be an issue of psychological safety. And some women and gender diverse people are experiencing harassment and are feeling silenced, which is an issue of psychological and physical safety. So how do we ensure that skilled trades workplaces are safe for all employees?
Yeah. You know, when we reviewed these questions, the first phrase that came to my mind when I heard this question was, that idea that the reduction in one person's privilege is not oppression, right? So if a bully's behavior is being curtailed, that is not oppression. I can understand the bully feeling uncomfortable because the way they have learned to be is no longer acceptable, but that can't be equated with the oppression that the victim of the bully is experiencing, right? So that's the first thing I think that we need to recognize, that that's a false equivalency to call the threat that a bully would experience by having their behavior curtailed as the same kind of workplace threat as the person who experiences harassment and bullying. So that's the first thing. I would say, however, that many people in the workplace who have seen a shift in the culture result in very punitive and dramatic responses to behavior that is inappropriate but not necessarily willfully harmful, that those individuals can feel under threat. And that's just because they're saying, things are changing. I don't feel like I'm changing quick enough. If I say the wrong thing to this new employee, are they going to walk me off the job site like I saw happen to Timmy yesterday? And I think that again goes back to the workplace culture that we're talking about, that the workplace culture has to be a learning environment where people are feeling like, if I make a mistake, my workplace is going to embrace me and educate me. And that kind of making a mistake, people shouldn't fear for that. It's the willful and targeting harassment and sexual harassment that needs to be eliminated. But if you misgender someone, if you tell an off-color joke that you don't even understand is an off-color joke, if you are slow to adopt the nuances of the workplace culture, that should be an opportunity for learning. And I think that this concern about men feeling threatened in the workplace is really about the workplace not responding properly in shifting the culture.
Thank you for that, Robert, and sorry, not Robert, Steve and Dana, did you have anything that you'd like to add?
I guess I'll just add, the example of like an off-color joke, you're not knowing, that it is off-color or thinking that it's okay. I mean, so much of this also is like an interpersonal dynamic. That off-color joke then receives the applause and the joy of your team members. And so how do we kind of, it really does take some of these culture change initiatives to say that, that's not funny, and that's not funny for these reasons. I mean, as part of, it's an education. And some of this stuff people have been laughing at for way too long. And it's almost like the riskiness gets the laughs a bit as well. Like the fact that it's not PC, and that like that also gets kind of positive jeers, I guess. So it will take, and that's where leadership comes on in terms of modeling. Often it's going to take some initiative to kind of counteract those. It's a group level effect at that point. And I also wanted to kind of maybe add the idea that some of these jokes or putting down of certain folks based on gender, sex, or other identities, I mean, this is also a game of status enhancement, putting others down in order to feel better and to gain status myself. And so that's like a powerful factor that's at play here. And so when a consultant comes in and says that type of behavior is no longer allowed, that's taking off the playing field, something that people are using to differentiate status. And so how do we give folks new language and new things to be caring about and thinking is important? There was one study, it's been done a while ago, but an oil rig, offshore oil rig, adopted a really staunch safety culture. And so they did all the organizational efforts in favor of safety, and which also opens up some characteristics and practices that we might not consider masculine. Asking for help if you need to, pointing out errors in the spirit of safety. And so to help kind of replace those narratives that are ongoing, and like the day-to-day banter can be super problematic. So what else are people want to think, what else are we going to talk about if we're not saying off-color things? So that's one example of an organization that kind of puts safety as a narrative in place to good effect.
Yeah, thank you for that. And we're going to move on to our next question. The intention behind this report is not about shaming the sector or the men in the sector. It's about honoring the voices of women and gender diverse people who have shared their experiences with us, and calling in the sector to create safe workplaces for all employees. We believe it's important that we separate the person from the behavior, that those engaging in the harmful behaviors be held accountable for their actions, and that they are supported to model the behaviors that will make workplaces safe for everyone, as has been mentioned by the panelists previously. And we all have a core need to belong, and a fear of social isolation or being ostracized from the group can act as barriers for leaders and individuals in the sector to go against the norm. And so Dana, this question is for you. How do we support the sector and leadership to see what is happening, to see the harmful impacts that it's having in the workplace, and to support them to move past shame and guilt to taking action?
Yeah, thanks for that question. Well, kind of similar to what we've been talking about, and I said before, so leaders are in a pivotal role here. And so when leaders and managers don't see the need to address the challenge, that change becomes almost impossible. And as you're getting at, it can feel threatening to be told the workplace that you feel comfortable in doesn't work for everyone, especially when you feel that the workplace works especially well for you. And now we're asking for change. And so in this kind of spirit of this, I think that Dolly Chug's concept of being a good-ish person comes into play. And Steve touched a little bit on this. What Dolly Chug explains is that while most of us in the world love to think of ourselves as good, upstanding, moral citizens, the reality is that we're all limited and we're all influenced by the amount of bias, stereotypes that we have of other people, usually of other people that are not like us. What this means then that colors the way that we view people, the way we treat other people, what we view as acceptable or even encouraged behavior in the workplace. So while we would like to think of ourselves as good people, maybe better is to think of all of ourselves as good-ish people. That is that we need to become more self-aware and open to what we've been talking about, which is learning. But that does, as your question implies, it means that we need to get out of our comfort zones. That often when we're talking about these topics, shame and guilt comes up for some folks. And reading a report can be difficult, especially when it is news to you, right? It's not news to some people, and some people reading the report are like, this feels affirming, and this is what I see and feel on a day-to-day basis. Others, it can be difficult and send them into red zone defensiveness, where they are going to shut down or they're going to argue. So what we need to encourage leaders to do is take a report such as this, try to tamp those feelings down and instead ask more questions. Ask more questions, try to learn, and then try to create spaces such as Stephanie was able to create so that people are sharing these types of experiences, because it's only by realizing that this stuff is taking place that you're able to kind of deal with it. So again, we're getting at this setting a learning mindset and really trying to create connections. When you're curious about, well, what are you experiencing at work? When you have empathy and curiosity, you're asking questions. You're also then going to start forming connections between people that are unlike you. And it's through these connections, which Steve was getting at, like if you can think of a woman in your life and you want to think about what she should and can experience at work, you can create a similar affective bond with folks in your own workplace. And then you start to care about them. So it's not just a nameless quote on a report. Instead, it's someone that you know and care about on the workplace. So thanks for the timer. That's what I have to say about that. I don't know if Steve or Robert have things they want to add.
Okay, thank you for that. And there's a question in the chat. The question is, has any leadership style or leadership model been shown to be more conducive to this sort of cultural changes that are being discussed? Does anyone want to respond to that first?
Well, I would say, and this just reinforces what Dana's saying, is that what have traditionally been understood to be the soft skill side of the equation, which in the trades is de-emphasized because of the hard skill production output requirements of the businesses. Empathy is crucial, and listening skills are crucial. Being able to be aware of observational, like what's going on with your crew or your team or what's happening in your company, and noting those sorts of things. And they've been de-emphasized often in the industry, and I think those are areas that really need some attention, and are really beneficial and actually can provide like almost immediate benefits in companies in terms of worker well-being, and this is for everyone. This is like everyone benefits from that, not just those from excluded communities, but everybody gets to benefit when you have empathetic leadership and leadership that is able to listen and take into account varying positions. So I'd say that's an area that the industry can really look to for some further development.
Yeah, thank you. And then Dana and Robert, did you want to add on?
I would just add, if people are looking for further reading, Lisa Nishi has an inclusive leadership model that was published in 2022. Has a lot of really great practices. And Dr. Creary at Wharton Business School, she has a lot of really good, she's got even a how-to tab on her website, which is awesome. So Dr. Creary and Dr. Nishi are scholars in this space.
Yeah, I would just say that on a very practical level is that just to dial up attentiveness to the human issues at the workplace. I mean, everybody in the workplace comes from a place, they have a family, they have a partner, a spouse, children, parents. They know how to interact with other human beings. I think that the workplace has sometimes kind of discouraged us from bringing those skills into the trades workplace. And we've kind of come into the workplace kind of putting up our walls so that we don't bring our human aspects to the workplace. So I'm not thinking that you need to get a PhD in modern communications. I think you just need to be willing to kind of be human and humane in the workplace and be a boss who values that, who models that, who promotes that in individuals. But if I can be frank, if the only people who advance in the workplace are assholes, then everybody will model that behavior, right? Because that's the behavior that gets promoted and encouraged here. And so if leaders want to transform the culture, you start rewarding the behavior that you want to see replicated.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think that leads into our final question, final three-part question. So we've heard from women and gender diverse people that they love their trades. They feel a sense of accomplishment and pride from their work. However, if day after day they're experiencing harassment, they're not going to remain in the sector. We've heard from women and gender diverse people that the high levels of harassment that they experience is the number one reason that they have left the trades or why they would consider leaving the trades. So what can we do? How can we ensure that the skilled trades sector retains women and gender diverse people? And so Steve, this three-part question is for you. You can choose which one or if you want to respond to all of them. So what are the practical and concrete steps that leaders in the sector can take? What are the actions that need to take place? How do we coordinate those actions? And how do we support organizations to learn from each other and best practice? And then the final part of the question is just how do we, what are the practical steps that individuals can take?
Yeah, there's lots to that question, so I cannot fully cover it all. I'm sure the other panelists will have lots to say on this too. But I would say, first and foremost, listen to the women and the folks who are marginalized in your workplace. Find out what's going on for them, pay attention to what's going on for them, and know what's happening so you have a better sense of what's going on in your own industry, in your own workplace. Education and awareness, floor to ceiling. It's not any one part of a business that requires education and awareness. It's the entire business, because quite frankly, we're talking about skilled trades, but this is societal wide issues and societal wide problems. So I say everyone needs human training on how to be better humans, and to take a little bit from what Robert was talking about, how to be humane and human. JEDI work, so justice, equity, diversity, inclusion work, it's continual, it's intentional, it's evolving. It means you're doing it all the time. You're continuing to do it. You're reviewing it. You're exploring it. Companies need to be transparent about what's happening in their companies. They need to be the same way that companies have to report on safety stats. This is a safety stat. Psychological safety in the workplace should be clear what's happening, clear when there's incidences going on, clear when there's investigations, and clear when there's action being taken, so that women and folks who are traditionally excluded can know, oh, that business is taking this seriously. They care about this. Oh, there's action being taken. If something happens in the workplace, I'm not just going to be left to the side. And I'd say the men want, I would say, because we're talking about this from the context that is a male-dominated industry, that men need to be involved in this conversation. They need to be participating, engaged, and working on it. And they are. And they're doing it in tons of different ways. And that needs to be kind of honored and supported and recognized by industry and by business. So that's a bit of a blah. I'm sure there's lots more to it, but I'm going to let Robert and Dana add their voices.
Yeah, I'd say that we started this conversation with recognizing that we needed to approach this work from an anti-oppressive lens. And I think that the anti-oppressive lens requires us to acknowledge that oppression is alive and well in the workplace. And we need to be able to call it that this workplace is a hostile environment for women and gender diverse individuals. This workplace is a hostile environment to racialized and Indigenous persons. This workplace is a hostile environment for queer folk. That is an artifact of the history of our society and the trades. That is not the case because we decided there's 3 men in an office somewhere who've decided to keep all those people out of this place. Now, maybe there are, but I don't think that that's how we've gotten here in general. So acknowledge it. Thorough onboarding for everybody. So every person you hire, every woman you hire, every man you hire, every gender diverse person gets a spiel about, hey, we acknowledge that this is a hostile environment. We're trying to change that. And then I think there need to be concrete supports for every man who needs help to change and every woman who needs help to be resilient and endure. And every man who needs help to be resilient and endure, and every woman who needs to change. Because I don't think we can think of this as a binary thing where the only perpetrators are men and the only victims are women. Although this study is highlighting how hostile the trades are to women, remember that hostility is virulent enough to affect everybody in the workplace, right? That patriarchy oppresses us all. And so I think that concrete supports, the acknowledgement, the thorough onboarding, for me, are the kind of is the 3-legged stool of getting started in this work.
That brings up a really important perspective that we haven't talked about. Is there is research that definitely supports the fact that witnessing sexual harassment as a man or as a woman with a target, as a man or a woman, it doesn't matter. There's negative effects for the witnesses of it as well. And so as much as we need to care about the targets and these negative effects that, you're taking the target's perspective in your report, if we zoom out and think about like the toxicity that creates, it's reverberating in the organization, whether or not folks realize it or not. So I think that's important to remember, and just to kind of piggyback on what Robert was saying, I was maybe not surprised given the gender demography of skilled trades, but 98% were male perpetrators. I have other work that shows that women are definitely playing their role, even in gender-based harassment. So it's not, women hold biases against their own group and other women. So there's plenty of bad behavior to go around. It's how can we raise the level of awareness and the willingness to acknowledge, learn, and change in order to make it feel different for people that are going to work. I know when I was reading the report, I was like, it just like hit my heart how women they love their jobs. They love being skilled trade folk. And like as a manager or an owner or supervisor, in any of those roles, can you imagine like knowing that your dedicated employee is thinking about leaving? And that is like something, especially in the employment context, in the like the economic housing context that we're in Nova Scotia. I mean, that should raise the eyebrows of everyone, that we're losing dedicated people, people that want to stay for an issue that we can address. It will be a journey, but it can be done. So that was striking to me.
And one of the things I also want to just name is that change is possible and change is happening. And so I want to also go into that space, because I think it can be very overwhelming when you look at the stats and feel about the and if you're living it, how terrible and challenging it can be. And so and that change is possible and transformation is possible, and it is happening on all kinds of levels. And I get to see it in sort of micro levels in terms of some responses from the folks who I work with and who do a course with me. But when we started out, we weren't sure, will we be able to make a change? Will there be able to have any effect? And of all the folks who've been through our course, we follow up with them 6-8 weeks later, and we ask them what they do, and they all do something. They're all taking action. So, and these were folks who never, many of them, not because they didn't want to, but they just never thought they should, or they weren't paying attention to it. But so, we have guys who start to speak up. We've had guys who've intervened in incidences where things were going off the rails that wasn't good and wasn't healthy. We have them taking responsibility for actions in their crew, and changing the narrative. We have them talking about it, like showing videos on what sexual harassment is in the workplace, because quite frankly, most folks don't really know what that is. They just know they have a fear of what it is. And so then you lay it out and they start to see, oh, it does actually include these other things that, oh yeah, that happens here. Maybe we should stop doing that. So I say that in the sense of like transformation is possible. This isn't, and change happened. There's systemic change that has to happen. That's massive. That's at the government level, that it's at the level of industry, that it's at the level of company policies and programs. And then there's the individual change that needs to happen as well. And those are confluences that have to go on concurrently, and hopefully, as there's more attention that comes to the sector on this, hopefully that will start to make a difference.
And I think one of the confluences that's influencing all of this is that this is a change that's required. I mean, there will be no construction companies that receive large government contracts without a diverse workforce. And you will not be able to recruit and retain a diverse workforce if you haven't made this change. There are more organizations that are being led by people who are historically oppressed. More women CEOs, more women architects and engineers, more racialized persons who are heading up major developments. And if your industry does not have the ability to communicate with and gain the confidence of those folk, you're not going to get that work. I know a person who was starting their own development firm, a woman who was hiring trades, serving as the general contractor for their own development, hiring tradespeople who would come in and ill-treat her as a woman, even though she is the person leading the development. Well, guess what? When that truck rolls away, a phone call is made, and that company is no longer on the job, and another company has the work. And it's as simple as that. If you cannot be a workplace that is able to conduct work in the way that it is expected to be conducted in the 21st century, you are a dinosaur avoiding the crunch. You're going the way of the dodo. this is an essential part of managing the workplace in the 21st century. And if you haven't noticed, with the increase in demand for the trades, you will not be able to populate your job site with individuals who accept hypermasculine and patriarchal and abusive culture. You just can't. There will be an increasing number of people, women, gender diverse folk, queer folk, racialized folk, and men who will not tolerate working in that environment. That is just the reality. We are in the 21st century.
Yeah, thank you for that. These are all really, really great points. And thank you all for the rich conversation that we've had today. We have time now to move to some questions from the audience. Just looking through the chat to see if there are any, or if there's any in the Q&A.
There is a question there about solving the problem with upper management. That I'm not sure if we've leaned heavily into that.
There are some comments and a question, so I'll just read it. This participant said that in their experience during training on these topics, the conversations afterwards, men are glad and grateful, and they found, but that afterwards they found it as boring and a waste of time. How do you change their mindset for training, as there's a large majority of the male population who do not want diverse individuals in male-dominated trades? I think we'll do that part and then we'll move on to the upper management part of the question.
Well, I think because I do training in the area, I can maybe be responsive to that. And I will say that most training sucks. It's terrible. And that's why people don't like it. And because it is boring and it's, checkbox, or, the online ones where you like spend 30 minutes and most people aren't paying attention or care. So if you're going to do this work, it has to be done well, and it has to be intentional, and it has to engage them on a personal level in ways that they're going to begin to care about. And if you don't do that, then it's a failure, and it actually can make things worse. So for companies, like, if you want to do it, you need to do it well, and don't just do it because this is a package or this is a checkbox, because that's the only result you're going to get is a bad one.
I would have to agree with Stephen that the trainer's first job is to engage their audience. And if they're not doing that, then you've got the wrong person. Doesn't matter how quality the content is. I was a race relations coordinator in a school district in 1994. And back then, this work was really, if I can be plain, it was beat up on Whitey Day. That's what it was. The people in the sector were social justice champions who used that opportunity to beat up on the offending population that was their audience. And of course, everybody left saying, "Oh, well, if the job was to frighten us and to distance us and to alienate us, job well done." I think that and I like the way Steve described it, our Jedi training has advanced. That we now understand that this training needs to start by building empathy in the individual. And you teach empathy first by demonstrating empathy for your audience, right? And I think that the trainers who come in to do this work with men in the trades must first connect with the men in the trades and demonstrate that they understand, appreciate, and even love those men. And once that bond is made, then you can lead and educate into the transformation. I will say this out loud, that there are some people who look at that training, people who train from that disposition, and actually think that a trainer like that is colluding with perpetrators and isn't being hard enough and isn't being, and I think that we need to really carefully think about what is our goal here, right? Because the goal is change, for us to have a more inclusive and equitable workplace for everybody. The goal is not exchange. We do not want to give people who are historically excluded their opportunity to oppress other people, right? So there is something subtle in the training that, I mean, by all accounts, Steve is the master of that. Has that the secret sauce of connecting and leading and educating.
Yeah, thank you for that. And then I believe we have time to respond to the second part of the question. So this individual has said that they reported twice for extreme behavior, one being assault, and upper management was empathetic in the beginning. However, when it came to accountability, upper management will do their best to diminish what is taking place. And when coming forward and you stand up, you experience pushback, and or the real issue is being hidden, or the person who is responsible is being coached how to respond. And if this person didn't request a third party to investigate, the truth would never have come out. And so they're saying again, upper management is the biggest problem. And so how do you overcome the issues and get the right support when you have climbed the ladder and don't receive justice?
It's a hard question. I mean, I don't know. Others might want to respond. Dana, do you want to respond to that one? No. Um, one of the things that I think is super important is there are industry networks of support. So, and when you can't find it within your own company, you got to find the supports elsewhere. And I think and finding the supports is crucial, like, because this is devastating. And to be alone in that or feel like you're negated in that is devastating. And the mental health anguish from that, the ramifications, and quite frankly, for workplaces, the ramifications in your workplace are terrible. So I think looking for the supports outside, and there are, whether it's like Women Unlimited, whether it's the Women in Apprenticeship Agency, whether it's the Women in Skilled Trades Agency Network, whatever, and there's a whole bunch of them, and maybe they should be put on the chat. The links for folks that are outside if women don't know those, or folks who are experiencing that don't know that, that those are places to go. That's one inadequate response to that.
Yeah, I think that Steve is right there. That when I encounter a person like in this situation, the first question is, or the first issue is, you must preserve your health. That's the first thing. We need to be attentive to your health, whatever that means. It is difficult to say to a person, well, that they might need to leave a workplace, but you certainly cannot allow a workplace to destroy your health, because then you're unable to work and unable to work elsewhere even. But I think that within the industry, seeking support, building your resource and support network so that you can maintain resilience, and even to report the lack of action within the industry outside of your organization. I think, for example, and I'm thinking of these large companies that have large government contracts, that if the government party that is engaging that company is getting regular reports of the toxicity in the workplace and the lack of effectiveness of management to address those, that that can create some movement in the corporation. Often the movement will be one-off and it won't be transformative, but I've certainly seen when an employee who has struggled has sought outside help and crafted a very articulate and descriptive and comprehensive letter and copied that letter to not just management, but presidents of companies and industry partners and union leaders that that they have found their organization responsive, at least in that incident. Again, that doesn't transform the culture, but it can prompt some action.
Yeah, thank you for that. And there's one more comment that I will read with a question. This individual has said that not to generalize all skilled trades, and including general laborer in here, since many trades require extra workers, but it is common to see that many of the workers have their own experiences of barriers, childhood trauma, and current life challenges. There can be challenges with literacy, and it might feel like there can be a quote unquote stunted emotional intelligence. They can be very reactive to feedback and discipline, and this is not specific to gendered or sexualized harassment. The focus can be dollar per hour, and harassment is not even in sight. In positions of leadership, some managers might struggle with providing feedback and discipline too. Many small to medium-sized businesses do not have HR support to help with it either. And the question is, have you observed a link between addressing harassment in the workplace and the organization's ability to generally address growth of the individuals and the collective? Does anyone feel as though they can respond to this question?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll take a piece of it. There's a lot there. And it kind of dovetails what we were talking about with the previous question. In the literature, the strongest predictor of sexual harassment is an organization's tolerance of sexual harassment. So this unresponsiveness, the ignoring, the brushing under the rug, or in the previous case, the outright denial, or resistance to investigate or what have you. And a lot of that stems from not listening and not caring about the employee's well-being, which I would relate here to growth of individuals, right? So how is an employee supposed to grow when they're dealing emotionally and socially with being assaulted on the job and that is being silenced? I mean, so there's I would say there's a linkage there. I don't know, it's not a one-to-one correlation, but it's the organization not fully recognizing the extent to which the social experiences, in this case, gender and sex-based harassment, relate to employee well-being and performance on the job. So when there's that disconnect there, it's extremely problematic for the individual and ultimately for the organization. But did you have more to say, Robert?
Yeah, just that, and I guess my language will be a little bit rough there, but this idea that individuals with low literacy who might have stunted emotional intelligence, low IQ is not an excuse for being an asshole, and that all peoples can be taught and modeled to be kind. I think that is the issue. And so really, if a supervisor or a foreman who is hiring laborers who aren't educated, who aren't literate, who are just day laborers, who are paid by the hour for the day, to Dana's point, it is the culture of the organization that will be reflected in the behavior of those persons. And if they are shown that you can be disrespectful and you can be discriminatory and you can be harassing, then those individuals may emulate that behavior without the nuance that a more sophisticated person could do and get away with. But that doesn't mean that those individuals are really the problem, if that makes sense. I have worked extensively with folk who have intellectual deficits and disabilities, and they, like I say, reflect the culture they're in, only more so.
Yeah, thank you for that. We have run out of time for our panel today. And I would just like to say thank you again to our panelists for the conversation, and to the audience members who attended and for your interest in this important topic. It is imperative that we are no longer silent on the issue of sexual and gender-based harassment in the skilled trades, as to remain silent would mean continuing to be part of a culture that enables it. We hope that our report and this conversation have contributed to breaking the silence, and that we can move past initial feelings of overwhelm and shame to acknowledge that the high level of harassment occurring is not acceptable. Women, gender diverse people, and all employees deserve to feel safe, respected, and valued at work. And we know that most people who experience workplace sexual and gender-based harassment do not want the individual who has been harassed to be fired. They want the behavior to stop, and they want to be heard, validated, and believed by their organizations. Through acknowledging the prevalence of sexual and gender-based harassment and committing to addressing the systemic roots of the issues, leaders in the skilled trades can set new standards and build better systems to ensure that their workplaces are safe, respectful, and inclusive. A healthy, inclusive workplace is better for everyone. And we know that organizational culture change takes time, and eliminating workplace sexual and gender-based harassment is going to take all of us. Everyone within the skilled trade sector has a role to play. And in our report, we have included 10 recommendations to address and prevent workplace sexual and gender-based harassment in the sector. And we hope that partners across the sector can come together to collaborate, as it's through collaboration and new approaches that we can disrupt the status quo and ensure that Nova Scotia skilled trades workplaces are safe for all employees. And with that, the webinar is over. Thank you for attending, and happy International Women's Day, and have a wonderful rest of your day.